Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Barbara Ungeert. I am the marketing manager for APA Journals. Our webinar today is JARS as a teaching tool, helping students think and write like scholars. I am joined today by Dr. LoriAnn Stretch, professor at the University of the Cumberlands, as well as Dr. Jayna Bonfini, associate professor at the University of the Cumberlands, as well as my colleague David Kofalt, APA product analyst and APA style expert. Okay, next slide, please. So our goals today are to share practical insights on how to use the APA-style journal article reporting standards, or JARS, as an instructor. Our agenda today is we'll provide an introduction to JARS for instructors, followed by the panelist presentation and discussion and a Q&A. A few housekeeping rules, as always. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand. You will receive an email with that information. The slides and additional resources will also be shared with all webinar attendees. And you are welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar using the chat. You will also be able to add questions for up to 3 days after this event, so we will make sure to check those. Okay, and I will hand it over to David.
All right, thanks, Barbara. Hi, everyone. So APA-style JARS, which are APA-style journal article reporting standards, or also just JARS, are a set of standards designed to enhance scientific rigor in peer-reviewed journal articles. In a nutshell, they are the standards provide a step-by-step guide on what information to include in a research paper. They're available for quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research, and include guidance on how to discuss race, ethnicity, and culture in scientific manuscripts. Although JARS were initially designed for journal authors, others, including instructors and students, have found them particularly useful. In a recent survey, instructors shared that JARS has been helpful in several ways, including providing students with structure for reporting and writing, helping students understand the work of peer reviewers, clarifying the role of each section of a research paper, and strengthening critiques of methods. They also serve as a checklist in writing and constructing of a manuscript. In fact, when asked about the likelihood of recommending JARS to a colleague, nearly 50% of instructors noted being extremely likely to recommend JARS. So today, to discuss their experience with JARS in the classroom, including ways they've incorporated the standards into teaching and benefits of doing so, are Drs. LoriAnn Stretch and Jayna Bonfini. Dr. Stretch is a professor and director of scholarly engagement at University of the Cumberlands. She's an advocate of APA-style JARS and incorporates it into the classroom for activities for graduate and doctoral students. She also uses APA-style JARS in her work mentoring junior faculty. And she has served as a clinical director of a multidisciplinary mental health agency and has practiced counseling for over 25 years. Dr. Bonfini is associate professor and director of the PhD program at University of the Cumberlands. She uses APA-style JARS as part of her teaching students in the classroom. She also uses APA-style JARS in her role as dissertation chair to identify relevant information and assess studies. And Dr. Bonfini also has significant clinical and research experience and has worked in a variety of settings, including a college counseling center, a psychiatric hospital, and in justice-involved organizations. Both of our panelists have also used JARS in their own research and manuscript writing. And now over to our panelists. So Dr. Stretch, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. So really, we want to focus on talking about the value of JARS in promoting rigorous and transparent research. We want to differentiate how it's used at the master's and doctoral level. I'm also going to speak a little bit about how I use it with junior faculty and students who are in the dissertation process. We're going to show you some examples of how we've applied the JARS and helping students enhance their abilities across the research spectrum. And then we're going to really just share the ways that we've been using it in our teaching and mentoring.
Okay, so why JARS matters across training levels. So at the master's level, it can really help students become better readers and better critics of research. And at the doctoral level, it can help them, become better researchers. It can help them write stronger studies. It really gives us guideposts to see what we are looking for when we're teaching master students, but it also can tell our doctoral students, hey, you're missing this piece. We need some more rigor around this. So I'm mostly going to focus on what we do at the master's level, and then Dr. Stretch is going to hand it over and talk about the doctoral level and junior faculty. All right, so here's some developmental uses. At the master's level, I really see JARS primarily as a tool to help them become greater consumers of research. A lot of times, my master students come into my research methods and program evaluation course, and they're like, I heard this course is hard. I dread this course. I don't want to do research. And I usually say, I know you guys are super excited, and the reason that you wanted to be a mental health clinician is because you're excited about research. And then they all look at me like, she's insane. But that's not true. In fact, I said, in order to know what to do with your clients, to know what the evidence base is, we have to be good consumers of research. And I always say my goal isn't for you to be a stats whiz by the end of this class, but I do want you to pick up journals in our field and read them and understand them and know if it's something that might be able to be applied to your own population that you work with. How do we become really good consumers of research? And so what JARS does is it gives them a structure for evaluating published studies in a really, really thoughtful and systematic way. It's not like we just throw the JARS at them and say, good luck, right? We really do try to scaffold assignments, and I'll walk through some examples of that a little bit later. And then at the doctoral level, the emphasis does shift. Here students are producing research, they're reporting their own studies, they're really learning to think like peer reviewers. I know Dr. Stretch has implemented a lot of peer review in her quantitative courses. We've done so across the dissertation sequence, just so that people understand what to look for. And a lot of times they're like, well, give me some guidance on how to do a peer review. JARS creates an opportunity for us to give them something for feedback. Even though the application does look different at each level, the shared goal is really the same. It's building that research literacy and strengthening methodological reasoning. So for the master's level, I'm going to mostly use examples from JARS-Qual, and then Dr. Stretch will mostly take on quant and rec. So in the master's classroom, I primarily use it as a scaffold for an article critique assignment. It really helps move students beyond those surface level reactions like, I like the article, or I didn't like the article, or that seemed cool. Instead, they begin asking more meaningful questions about like what is present, what's missing, what seems unclear. Because I'm like, if you're reading this and you're like, I have really no idea what they're saying. I've read it 3 times. I've used JARS. I don't know. I'm like, and a lot of times students think, okay, if it's published, it's perfect. And I think it really helps demystify that sometimes articles are published and they do have some flaws. And we can talk about those flaws. We can talk about those limitations. We can also look at alignment and whether the pieces of the study fit well together. So I use JARS-Qual not just for the critique assignments, but also for instruction, also for formative feedback. And so in a sense, it can become both a teaching framework and then also as a learning support. So my focus here is just not just training them to like publish their own studies, but it's really helping them read qualitative studies critically and then also with confidence. So they know what they're doing and they know how to sort of write up the critique. All right. So a lot of times my master students that I work with, they need a practical structure for reading qualitative research. So typically what we do first before we even introduce this is we give them sort of a lesson on basic qualitative methodology, basic structures. We don't go into like sort of itty bitty nuances. We're not like, here's the difference between constructivist grounded theory and grounded theory and all the new, we don't do that. We kind of keep it broad at the master's level. But what JARS-Qual can do for us is it can really turn assignments into guided inquiry. Like, what should I expect to see? And how do I evaluate whether or not the author did report it clearly? Sometimes, I do think that the framework is helpful because I think when they're first learning the basics of research, even qualitative research, they can find it a little bit difficult to decode. A lot of times the first thing they focus on is, it's a small sample size. I'm like, well, it can be. It's allowed to be in qual. And so then they're like, oh, now I don't know. Because for them, for quant, if the number is an N of like 25, they're like, well, that's an easy one to critique. But if the N is 25 in a qual study, that's a pretty large qual study. And so a lot of times they don't know yet what a Strong's method section looks like for qualitative research, and they sometimes can confuse compelling findings with ones that might not be. And so it really helps address that by giving them that concrete review framework. And I also think it kind of supports that critical thinking without expecting students to already function as advanced researchers, like we would expect somebody who's like finishing up their dissertation. In other words, it gives them just enough structure to ask better questions and to make even more informed judgments. All right, so what I do is I introduce it after they learn those basic qual traditions so that they have some conceptual foundations first. So I teach them like, here's what grounded theory is, here's an example, here's a study that we can read that exemplifies it, here's case study, here's phenomenology, and so I do that first. And then I also talk about trustworthiness sort of as a broad brush, usually the classic Lincoln Guba from 1985. So I present JARS as a reader's tool, not simply as a checklist. So we do use it as a checklist later, but when we're first using it, we use it as a guide because I want them to read these articles with the standards in mind and recognize how strong reporting can help readers and consumers of research understand and then evaluate the study. So I usually focus on like the major categories. I have a worksheet where it's like, here's the problem, the purpose, the approach. And so then we go through and we list all of those things and we're like, okay, what's missing? What more information do we need? And sometimes it could require some translation, but oftentimes the students, once they have a good foundation of what we mean by qualitative, what we mean by trustworthiness, they can start to offer their own critiques. And sometimes some of their critiques can be pretty sophisticated in terms of implications. They'll say something like, how can they say that that's the implication of this when this was their end and it was a very homogenous population and they're trying to extrapolate it to a much bigger one? And I'm like, that is an excellent question. They're like, can I put that in my critique? You sure can, you should. Right. And so oftentimes you see these light bulb moments because they're following this as a reading document, as a guide, and it helps them formulate their own questions. All right, so this is just sort of a sample assignment that we use. And so our students select or that we assign them, we give them sort of a choice set. That way, the rest of the instructors teaching the course, they're not like having to read 30 different research assignments. I might give them a choice of 5. And so they select one of those and then they complete a structured critique using a JARS aligned template. And so the goal is to teach them to critique fairly. And I usually tell them fairly, like, let's steel man their argument. Like, let's not just start tearing it down because it was published for a reason. It's trying to contribute to the literature in a particular way. Let's give it the best possible reading. So doing so fairly. And then ask them to identify what the authors reported clearly, what seemed vague, what seemed underdeveloped, and then how that design, the sampling, data collection, analysis, how everything is aligned. Because sometimes things that look really good singularly, once you put them all together, you're like, that doesn't seem quite aligned. They'll say, oh, I'm using this pragmatic tradition. And I'm like, but you're also using phenomenology. Right? Like that, not always aligned. Or they're grounding it in a theory that doesn't seem quite related to their research questions and their populations. Like, how are we making this leap? And sometimes perhaps there was a paragraph or two that got put on the cutting room floor from an editor or something. Perhaps that's what happened. Is there something that could make it better? How would you improve it? Because I also have a section where, what else would you want to see? What else would you want to know? How would you improve it? But most importantly, JARS really helps them support their critique with evidence from the article, rather than relying on their own personal opinion or first read. And I think that expectation really helps them reinforce that a critique isn't just an exercise to pass the class, really. It's an academic-based skill. It's for you to have that skill. And I love skills because once you have them, you have them. You can always increase them, but trying to get them to that point where they can pick up that journal article of our flagship journals, open it, read it, and say, this is good research. Maybe I can use it too. Really want them to be good consumers. And so I've also turned the standards into like prompts. So this slide just shows how I translate the standards into questions that students actually can use. So for example, instead of them asking them to evaluate reporting quality in abstract terms, I ask concrete questions like, is this clear? Is it justified? Do the authors identify the approach and explain why it fits? And usually in class, I will send this in advance with an article that we will do in class. And then I'll pull up the standards and we'll go through it. We'll go through each one of them. Sometimes we do breakout rooms, and I'm like, okay, you guys will do purpose, approach, participants, data collection, and you guys will do data analysis, researcher stance, methodological. You guys will do results discussion, and then we all come together and see how we can do that collaboratively. So I think it's really a good idea for them to start talking about research too, and using these prompts can help with that. So this is sort of how I do it. But I really like when they start to internalize these questions and then they start to apply them independently. So sometimes they can if we talk about a different study in class and I don't even have the JARS up, they'll say, wait a minute, how did they go from the raw findings, the raw data to the that's kind of a leap. They didn't really explain that. I'm like, it's a good point. It's like I had this one student say they were reading an article. It's like, and then a miracle occurs and they got these findings. What happened? And they're like, I don't understand. I'm like, you could write about that. They're like, okay, all right, I'm going to do that. I'm really upset about this. I'm like, you should be. Okay, fine. But it gets them really excited about it, especially when they start noticing things that aren't right. They're like, oh my goodness, I'm learning. And honestly, for those of you who are educators, is it not the best feeling in the world when you see a student have that light bulb moment and they get it and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this. I have this new skill and I'm going to show it off in my paper. I love it. It's so fun. All right, so here's a sample critique article, a little prompt that I might use. I might say, using JARS-Qual, evaluate how clearly and rigorously this author reported the study. Look at the purpose, the findings. Sometimes I use the little chart that I just had on the last slide. And I think it really helps because it can help make those expectations explicitly. This is what I expect you to do. It's not as if you have to guess what I'm asking you to do. And then I also use it to align the rubric and feedback with instructions. So David and Barbara sent us the survey results from the instructors who completed the APA survey on JARS. And one of the comments, loved it, could have written it myself. It said, JARS serves as the backbone of my grading rubric. And I'm like, I could not agree more because it can really function as a practical feedback tool. You can tie feedback to specific reporting elements rather than just frame it in broad and vague terms. And I think this expectation, it just makes it really clear for students and gives them a more direct path for any revisions that you might give them too. It's like, okay, can you pay attention to this one area? So I have little phrases. I don't know how many of you do this, but I tend to say the same things over and over again in terms of feedback for certain articles. And so I have little tricks that I have where I save some feedback and I'll just pull them into other comments. But, your critique would be stronger if you address this piece because perhaps it was missing. Or you might note that it seems credible, but you really don't tell me that with evidence from the article. You just want me to take your word for it. It's like the quote unquote, trust me, bro approach. And that's just not what we're going to do here. That's not a question that we're answering here. We need to really support it with evidence. And so I do think that this is about being clear and being coherent with what we're doing and being really intentional with how we're asking people to complete tasks and complete assignments. I do think that as students become more familiar, they can use them to evaluate their own work. So I've told students, listen, this isn't the only class you're going to have to write a research paper for, or do an article critique of, or do peer review. Use these in other classes, take them with you. This isn't just a research methods and program evaluation tool. This is a tool to help you and assist you not only in your program, but across your career. All right, so I have some outcomes that I use for my master's level students. And one of them, again, is to be able to read research with less intimidation. I often ask them at the very beginning of the course, a lot of times people are anxious about this class. If that's you, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is it? 1, I'm super excited, chilling, great. 10, whew, really nervous. I've had people put in 152 as their number, and I've had other people put ones. And so what I love to do is at the end, I ask them the same question, and I love to show them data-wise how everybody kind of calmed down as a result. And I think using JARS is a big part of it. I think it helps demystify what we're trying to do in teaching people to be good consumers of research. It helps them identify key parts of studies. It helps them distinguish just describing a study, which I ask them to do in sort of lit reviews, and critiquing a study, which is a different enterprise. how to identify strengths and limitations, and not just the limitations that the authors list themselves, right? How to talk about rigor, how to talk about transparency, and then how to carry those habits into their own practice. So in a way, JARS does, really does support this developmental pipeline. So I work a lot with the master students in their research course. I also work with doc students, but the way that we have it structured, and Dr. Stretch will talk about this in a bit, it really helps lay that groundwork. So this is the expectations that we have for our students when they leave our program as master students. It is a little bit different once they become doctoral students because they're moving from learning how to do research, learning about components of research, to also learning to be scholars.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Bonfini. And one of the things I will say about our master's research, we actually use all the primary JARS in that class. So we use JARS-Qual, JARS Mixed Methods, JARS-Quant, and JARS-Rec, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. And so it really helps students start to begin to look at different designs and have a means for understanding it. As they move into the doctoral level, or they join us at the doctoral level, we really want JARS to become a thinking tool, a tool that really shapes how they're thinking. I often tell students you're becoming doctoral. You need to think doctoral, and that JARS is really the tool that shapes the way they do that. We actually introduce them to JARS in our writing class. And so when they take a professional writing class early in the program, they're introduced to this as a structure for writing an article, a way to help them and guide them in what needs to be in their article. Then when they get into their research courses, we have it broken up by a qualitative research methods and a quantitative research methods. They use the tools in both of these classes, in the intermediate classes. I teach quant, so I'm going to focus on the quantitative JARS and how I use that through the intermediate quantitative class and the advanced quantitative, and then take it on into dissertation and for junior faculty. So we're asking them to critique, design, write, and peer review. So this can be used for all of these different levels, and it has been really, really powerful to see the transition and the depth of interaction that we're seeing students be able to move to. Frequently, when students start my class, I will say something like, my goal by the time you finish this class is that you will not skip the results section of all the articles. And they all kind of laugh and put their heads down and squirm a little. They're like, oh, you know that, huh? Yeah, well, I know that. I know what you're doing. Okay. And so I want you to be able to break it down. I want you to understand what is there, what is missing, and what concerns you might have about using this to inform evidence-based practice. Jayna, next slide. So early stage, really focusing on the critique and the comprehension, right? We're trying to get them to use the language of research. We're trying to get them to understand what is missing. Why is it important that it's missing, right? And how does that impact the implications, the recommendations for practice, the recommendations for future research? What limitations are discussed, which ones aren't? I call them my research detectives. In the early stage, they're really using the core JARS. So for my class, they're using JARS-Quant. We're really focusing on really getting them to understand JARS quantitative, how they use it, when to use it. And what I really love is usually by the end of the class, when they're talking about each other's work, they're using JARS to critique each other's proposals too. So they're starting to use it as a tool for giving feedback as well as a tool for critiquing. So that moves us to the mid stage, where now they're designing a research proposal. They're using the JARS to help guide that design, and they're using it to evaluate each other's, because they have to evaluate each other's work as part of the peer review process. Then we move to the advanced stage, where they're actually developing a dissertation, or they may be developing a research article, and they're going through pre-review. A lot of the work I do with junior faculty is helping them take that dissertation work that they did and convert it into a research article. And so I will use the JARS to help guide how they're going to write that article and how they're going to transform that dissertation work into a publishable article. Next slide. So 734 is our intermediate. We expect students already come with the basic knowledge of quantitative research, so they start at an intermediate quantitative level. And so this is a discussion question that they have in week 2 of that course. They have to identify 2 strengths, 2 limitations using JARS-Quant. They have to analyze 1 descriptive statistic, just starting off easy for them, not trying to, make them pull their hair out with a Mancova or anything. And then they have to do the ethical and competency considerations and provide the APA citation and reference. So the goal here, and this is a shift for a lot of students, I'm moving them from talking about what was studied to how it was studied, and really stressing that emphasis that we're not focused so much on the content as we are on how it was done. Next slide. So this is an example from a student's discussion board, just to show you kind of what they're saying. The abstract provided the research problem and rationale, but lacks a clearly stated hypothesis and design. Participant demographics are incomplete, and the statistical procedures are not specified. Before I was using JARS, they would have said, well, I think the abstract is missing some things. I'm not really sure who the study was about. Right? This is very different feedback that they're giving about an article, right? A limitation is the absence of participant flow data. That's language they got from JARS, right? Group sizes across the stages are unclear. How are we using an ANOVA if they have inequitable sizes in their groups, right? So they're starting to ask those deeper questions, which I love. Next slide. So why does it matter? We're moving them into this methodological critique, right? Identifying missing reporting elements, how to interpret their statistical choices. They also begin to delve into some of the more advanced JARS where it might be looking at specific designs. I'm not asking them to report on those at this point, but I introduce them as a scaffolding method. Okay, now we've done JARS-Quant. Did you know there's these other JARS that you can use as well as you're looking towards developing your proposal? You might want to think about those. They begin to connect ethics and best guidelines for best practices to the work that they're doing. They also begin to think like reviewers. They start to begin to embody what it means to be a researcher and why all of these elements are important for replication and for transparency. They start to talk like future authors. Their writing is enhanced. And all along, we're a KCREP program for the Council of Accredited Counseling-Related Education Programs. So we have these professional standards that they are required to meet in this course, right? And the JARS ties directly into these standards and such a great tool for having that happen. Next slide. So here we are going to show you an example. We have students' permission to share this. Trent is an amazing student, but this is a demonstration that he did in our 738, which is our advanced quantitative course. So this is a demonstration article critique. Now, at the advanced course, they now have to use 2 forms of JARS. So they have to use JARS-Quant plus a design-specific JARS or JARS-REC, which is the race, ethnic, and cultural one, which I love. Because a lot of times students will review an article using, say, JARS-Qual, JARS-Quant, and they're like, oh, it's not so bad. Then they bring in JARS-REC and they go, oh my goodness, how did this get published? And so it's really interesting to see their reactions, and it also spikes their social justice advocacy and gets them to really think through their own recruitment strategies for their own proposals that they're making as well. So here the focus is on methodological alignment, statistical appropriateness, ethical and cultural considerations. In the class, they do a 12 to 20-minute presentation. They have to provide a structured handout. It could be the article annotated. It could be a PowerPoint. They can do it in lots of different ways. At this level, I don't say you must do it this way. I really like to see how they creatively embark on it. And then we have a peer Q&A process where, again, the peers are supposed to be using JARS to ask critical questions that maybe didn't come up in the person's presentation. We're going to show you about 4.5 minutes of this presentation. I hope we shared sound. Did we share sound? Yes, we did. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Trent Hepting, and I'm going to do a review of the article Interaction of Imposter Phenomenon and Research Self-Efficacy on Scholarly Productivity by Kelly Wester et al. This was published in the Counselor Education and Supervision Journal in December of 2020. I'm going to be using JARS-Quant and JARS-REC to kind of critique and review this article. As you can see, I have some things highlighted. Those in blue are going to be for JARS-Quant. Those in green are going to be for JARS-Rec. There is going to be some overlap between the two of them, but just wanted to highlight that. So let's go ahead and jump into this article. So the title itself is going to really need to describe the population. So from this initial piece, it's the interaction, but among who? Among where? I'm really not sure what populations were being studied. So something that could improve this is going to be among counselors in KCREP accredited universities. That's really going to be kind of who the population specifically is for, and would just give us clarity into who we are studying from the get-go. As we move into the abstract, they do explain the sample size in the population, but they don't describe the research design, the materials or instruments used, the procedures, or even their findings. They really just go through and describe, here's the population that we are working with. Something of note here is that one of the hypotheses specifically examines how race, ethnicity, gender, and the career position impact imposter phenomenon, but it is not described in this abstract whatsoever. So just something unique that our hypothesis talks about those components, but our abstract ignores it altogether. As we kind of move into our introduction and just some of the content about the authors, something that would be beneficial is including a positionality statement as well as author contributions. So here it's great that it tells us here's who all of the authors are and what universities they work with. It's standard, but it would also be kind of best practice within JARS-Rec and kind of moving forward to also include contributions. This says this individual was an author, this person conducted some of the analyses, this person helped us write. Different things of that nature would really help support this article as well. But as we move into more of this discussion piece, I want to highlight that they do describe practical implications. So it's this sentence here that says, in the case of academia and scholarly productivity, an example would be a faculty member who avoids engaging in research behaviors or producing scholarly work because of fears that others will discover their lack of competence in that area. So again, just an implication for imposter phenomenon. Something again to note here is that throughout this section, the authors talk about achievement goals theory, but they do not describe if that is the theoretical approach they're using throughout this research or the article. So they talk about it, but maybe is implied that here's the theoretical framework we're using, but also they just talk about it as a potential. So it's really uncertain how that achievement goals theory is being applied to this research itself. As I continue on, we can look at kind of this section here that talks about a little bit more research. But what's of note is that, again, there is only a brief literature review on race, ethnicity, gender, and position. It's going to be roughly these two sentences here. But the reason I'm highlighting this is that the research questions specifically talk about race, gender, ethnicity, and position, and yet the research doesn't really address any of those or talk much about it. They do highlight that says, yes, there are differences, but there's not a lot of content or context here with this. They do have excellent research questions. So there are 4 of them. What is the prevalence of IEP among counselor educators? Does IEP differ by race, ethnicity, gender, and position as counselor educators? Do IEP and research self-efficacy explain counselor educators' scholarly productivity? And does IEP moderate the relationship between research self-efficacy and scholarly productivity? So again, excellent questions that they have kind of provided here. When it comes to our methodology or methods section, they've got a really clear research design. I'm not going to read it, but it does cover, here is the type of study that we are doing, that research method, as well as the population of 247 counselors. Something I do have a question about is this section that says, of the sample, 86 individuals did not identify their gender or race, leaving 161 individuals who did report those items. And as I'm doing some of my statistical analysis, this is more for class, but if I have blank data, sometimes the programs that I'm using, specifically JASP, are going to give me error messages. And I'm just more curious on how we as researchers account for that and what we can do if we get error message within the systems themselves. So something we can talk about. As we continue on to more of the participants, they get a lot of information here, but something to note is that they give descriptive information about the participants, again, race, age, gender, different things along those lines, but they don't talk about inclusion or exclusion criteria for how they joined the study. They just say, here is the population of individuals that we're working with. So it's really hard to say, all right, did we include individuals? Again, coming up here to these that did not identify gender or race, why were they included if we are looking at gender and race within our hypotheses? And so just something to, again, be very cognizant of that says, hey, why didn't we provide these, and or why didn't we include or did include or did not include these individuals, and just giving more clarity on that.
We can go ahead and move on.
When it comes to our measures, this section can be improved.
All right, going to the next slide. So the shift we see is the students definitely are asking better research questions, right? They're starting to ask questions that before they were just like, yeah, it was a good article, and here's, what I would do with it. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Did you actually critique the article, or are you just saying that, yeah, you would like to use it? They justify their decisions, right? Like why they're making the decision they are. They now have substance to use to support why they're making the decisions they are. They can also identify bias and limitations, as you saw when Trent was talking through it. They begin to utilize what they're learning from the critiques to improve their own writing, which is really powerful, right? Like I will see them submit a proposal, then they'll listen or participate in a review of an article, and they'll be like, oh, I didn't even think about that in my proposal. And they go back and they modify their proposal, right? So they're learning through this process of not only doing and using JARS to do the article critiques, but because they're reviewing articles together in class, then they're learning from that experience of what needs to be included, why it needs to be included, and how to include it, which is a really powerful process. So they're starting to anticipate what's needed in their articles and being able to self-evaluate their own work as well as the work of their peers. Next slide. So JARS as a pre-reviewer. So the alignment between research questions, variables, and analysis. So the first thing I'll do when somebody submits something to me that they want to consider for publication is I'm going to go through that process, right? I'm going to use JARS. I'm going to see, is everything in alignment? Is it working? One of the other ways that I've used it is I've actually created a little AI chatbot that helps me do this using the JARS, which has been something that's been really powerful to give very substantive feedback. I use something called BoodleBot, which is a FERPA, HIPAA secure AI system. That's also far more environmentally sound than most AIs. And so I've built this little chatbot within there that will actually do the analysis for me and provide initial feedback. I don't rely solely on it, but it is a really good start, and it's getting better and better as we work to fine tune it. So we go through the transparency of procedures. Is there information that's missing that would inhibit somebody else from being able to replicate your study? And all of this is guided by using the JARS in the process. So all of this, the reporting standards, the ethical clarity, the cultural responsiveness, we evaluate it using those particular JARS. Next one. So this is a scaffold that I created to kind of show how it works, right? What's happening at each level of the process? Because for us, this is a whole system of using JARS throughout our curriculum. Starts at the master's level, where they're just asked to identify the components, recognize the strengths and limitations, and begin applying those standards. Then they move into that intermediate doctoral level class. They're starting to analyze the design and the methods. They're using it to critique the methodology, interpret, statistical and ethical considerations. In the advanced class, they then move to much more methodological rigor and alignment. Like they're able to see when things aren't connecting. They begin to integrate more than just the basic jars. They're starting to add jars rack and other design specific jars. And they really start to delve into cultural responsiveness bias and their role as advocates, as reviewers, as authors, as researchers for cultural responsiveness. In the dissertation and manuscript process, I think my students probably get very tired of me referencing JARS, but I keep sending them back to it. But I want to make sure that it's aligned with JARS, still respecting our dissertation template, but are you using those tools within the JARS to guide what you're putting into those sections? It helps them write with that transparency and precision. I think that chapter 3 drives most doc students crazy because it's so detailed in the methodological, especially within the quant realm. And so this really gives them the questions that they need to answer as they're writing that chapter 3. It also begins to anticipate, what's my committee going to ask me? What are my peer reviewers? Because we also use a process of peer review where dissertation students are matched to each other and they have to review each other's work. And again, I say use JARS. This is your guiding principle, right? Use the JARS so that you can give very substantive feedback. And then also they have to go through what's called a mock review for their proposal. They have to present it to their dissertation cohort, usually a group of 8 to 12 other students. They present it, and again, the peer reviewers are using JARS to help guide that feedback that they're getting during their mock review so that by the time they actually get to their dissertation proposal and their dissertation defense, they've already presented this twice before to me and their triadic peer reviewer and during their class, their cohort class. So that really makes the quality very powerful and very clean. And then again, for junior faculty or even for my own publication process, using it as a peer review tool to ensure that I've met all of those standards as well as I can within the page limits that I'm given, and trying to be true to that experience. I just did a mixed methods content analysis of 198 journal articles, try to meet that page limit using JARS. That's pretty intense. It was quite the efforts there. Next slide. So this is some of the type of feedback that even as an instructor that JARS could help me provide students, right? So I'm able to use JARS when I'm grading, when I'm reviewing student feedback to provide very substantive, evidence-based feedback to them. So I'm grounding the feedback that I give students in the JARS so they can say, well, why do you say that's important, Dr. LA? Well, that's what APA said was important, actually. And here's the resource. The next slide. This is just a key takeaway. So the reasons that Dr. Bonfini and I love JARS and are like the JARS advocates are for enhancing research skills, supporting academic writing, preparing students for publication, both to digest and to craft, and boosting their confidence. I think that's the one thing that I really take away from the experience is that students feel very grounded in their ability to critique and to write because they have a tool that's giving them the outline, the structure for what they need to do that is accepted as a best practice in the field. It just gives them so much more confidence in their abilities to do it. And even in peer reviewing, I think it's so funny to me when they first start peer reviewing, they're like, well, that was a nice presentation. And I'm like, all right, let's get into the JARS. Enough cheerleading. Let's get into JARS. And then they start to ask real substantive questions that really begin to enhance the work that their partner or the cohort member is doing. So that analysis just skyrockets. All right. And then I think maybe yes, and thank you. And we welcome questions. I did see somebody ask about undergraduate. I've taught at the undergraduate level too. I would absolutely use JARS at the undergraduate level. I think that it is an appropriate tool, again, providing concrete structure for the students to be able to know what questions to ask, what should be in these articles, and also in structuring their own. It can be used not just like I don't like to call it a checklist. I really like it to be more of a teaching tool, like a guided process for what you should include in each part of your proposal. That's how I like to see it. Yes, I agree. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you both very much for sharing your experience. It's always great to just hear both of you talk and share your experience with working with students. not only using JARS for, that kind of rubric for evaluating research, but kind of breaking down some of those worries and anxieties. I love the term you used, research detectives.
Mhm.
Kind of taking an active role in evaluating rather than, being faced with, yeah, you had mentioned feeling overwhelmed. So I think that's a great approach.
And
On
just to note, David, we use these two books as our textbooks in the intermediate and advanced research classes. These are textbooks, the Cooper one, especially for me, we embed those into the class as well for the students. And I think that that is another way to enhance the JARS experience if you're going to implement this in a classroom, especially is to have those books because I think they help explain why things are important and how to do things at a deeper level than just the tools that we have in JARS alone. Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We have another webinar that we did in the fall with Dr. Levitt was involved too, and just yeah, great resources. Also, the publication manual has chapter 3 with JARS,
Mhm.
which is wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, you both had mentioned students potentially feeling overwhelmed. What would you recommend for instructors who haven't yet introduced JARS, might want to introduce JARS, but maybe that instructor is feeling overwhelmed? And what do you recommend to them for how best to get started in sharing JARS, incorporating JARS into the classroom? Which classes might be best?
Mhm. Dr. Bonfini, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think I mean, like I said, I teach research methods, so that's like an easy win right there. Um, but we can use it in assessments. We can use it in our writing. We can use it in all kinds of different classes. I always say like the best way to get into it is just to get into it and to have an example to use. And it doesn't even have to be like a published example. Like we have tools that we can use to put together information very quickly, and to have a side by side that you're showing of your example and then questions that you're asking that align with JAR. So I think that's a good entry point. I think sometimes some students, until they do it themselves, they don't realize how to do it. So giving an example and then doing it's sort of like the show one, do one, teach one, not to use sort of a medical model, but in order for them to be comfortable, give them an example and then set them into groups and have them collaborate on how to do it and then bring it back before they have to do that on their own for any sort of grade. So that's how I would set it up. But again, like I said, it fits really well in research methods, but in professional writing classes, it's great. In order to do a lit review, it's really good. I teach a very early course in the doctoral program. It's like a professional identity course where it's kind of like a survey course. Well, in the research part of it, I want them to be introduced to it, but I need to introduce it to them much earlier when they're talking about teaching, when they're talking about supervision, when they're talking about all these things to make sure that we are aligning with certain standards. And so I think it can be applicable to many classes.
Great.
Hmm. I use it as an article critique tool in multiple classes. Like I teach the advanced assessment at times and things like that. And even then, I'm like, okay, you have these tools that are available to you to understand and break down these articles, right? You don't have to skip sections that are overwhelming to you. You can use these tools to help you break it down, help you organize your notes, help you have better conversations about it in class. So I think that it shouldn't be just used just in research. I love using it in the research classes, but I think it can be used in a lot of different classes. One of my students I taught last night, and she was like, I think I'm scared to use anything in our profession at this point, right? Because she had started to question everything in the process. And it's not that I want them to shut down from using research, but I want them to know enough that they can use it wisely and they can use it in an informed stance. So that's what's important to me is that, okay, how can you use this, right? They've said you can use it in these ways, but now after looking at JARS, you can see that this implication they've given or this recommendation isn't really supported by this research. So what parts of this article can you use and what parts maybe we wouldn't want to use, right? So I think that piece is important. For me, one of the ways that I first started using JARS was just applying it to my own writing. And that would be something I would encourage everybody to do, right? Like if most of us, I'm assuming, have to publish to, or not so we don't perish. So therefore, we need to be writing ourselves, right? And so I also try to role model when I'm writing, because I very rarely write just myself. I'm usually writing with students. I'm role modeling using JARS, like, oh, let's look at this section today in our working session and have we answered these questions, right? So I'm trying to role model that in day-to-day work, not just in classwork. And I think that is important as well for students to see, and it gives me more practice in it as well so that I can become more and more grounded. We also did a series, as David didn't know, for UC where we talked about each of the JARS. And one of the things I used was good old Google Notebook LM, which I absolutely love. You know, as long as it's a public facing open source resource, you can drop that into Google Notebook. You would never drop anything that's copyrighted into Google Notebook. And so creating like explainers, like the video explainers, creating podcasts, which the I would say the younger generation particularly connect with a lot, are those short pieces that are anywhere from, 6 to 20 minutes they can usually digest. And giving them introductions to the material in that way has been really helpful. I've also created infographics on the JARS to show kind of the path of how to work through JARS. And I think those tools help me understand it as the instructor, and it also helps the students have multiple ways to digest the material instead of just this long sheet of things you have to check off as you're going through the process. Mm-hmm.
Great. And LA, so just to kind of follow up a bit on you using JARS in your own work, when do you incorporate JARS in the process? Is it
At the beginning.
writing for, yeah. If you can just explain that a bit to us, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. So, whenever I'm writing an article, like I said, I just completed the JARS content analysis, and it was really kind of qualitative and quantitative. So it was mixed methods. And so we went through that process and we actually assigned sections to people. Like, you go write this section, you go write, and just divided up the JARS. That's what we did. It's just like said, okay, it was a 12-person team, and everybody took a couple of sections of JARS. They wrote it, we brought it back together, we did a peer review of it. So everybody was reviewing everybody else's, again, using that list of have we done all of these things? We were 10 pages over our page limit, so we had to figure out how to bring it down to the page limit process, right? But that, I think, made it easier because we knew we had all the pieces. Now it was figuring out how to make it more condensed and maybe seeing where, because sometimes in using JARS, you will find that you repeat things in different places. So we were able to say, okay, this part really needs to be here, but maybe it doesn't need to be repeated here, and so we were able to finally get down to the page limit. But I think it helped us prioritize, well, it helped us organize our writing, especially with such a large team. It helped us peer review as a large team. And then it helped us be able to consolidate and try to meet that page limit in the most effective way we could.
Great. Yeah,
Mhm.
no, thank you. Um, so I think we've got maybe time for two more questions before we hand it over to Barbara to close out. One, I do want to address a question that we did receive in the survey. We had a question about there are going to be some terms in the sets of standards that might not be familiar to some students. We included in our resources for this webinar a link to the JARS glossary, which is great. And then also the APA Dictionary of Psychology, both free and open resources. So if you have questions, the term that might not be familiar, those are always great to refer to. And I guess my final question for the two of you, and I know you've touched on a lot of this a bit, but students that are graduating, once students leave your guidance, what might be the main thing you want them to take away from their work with JARS?
Dr. Bonfini, start at the masters.
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway for me is like, I really want for students, if they're going to do their own research, I want them to have really strong scholarly writing. I want them to be clear. I want them to be transparent. I want them to be able to pick up, like I said before, a journal article, read it, understand it, not skim it, be able to actually read and understand it, and know whether or not this evidence that they provided could be something that might be useful for their own. Because a lot of our master students do not plan to do doctoral study. They want to be clinicians. But I do think that as our field grows, as our field uses more and more evidence-based practices, which we all should be using, to be able to be a good consumer of that research and to know what it's saying clearly. Because I mean, I'm sure several of us, if we've practiced before, we know that there have been people who are like, oh, this looks like a good technique. Let me go and use it. And it's an abject disaster because it's not applicable to that population. I really want students to be able to benefit from the research we're doing in our field and to be able to understand whether or not that applies to their clinical practice.
Yeah. For me, I'm training people how to teach, right? So I'm teaching them to be supervisors, teachers, researchers, all of that. So I think one of the biggest compliments I've ever had is the student who said, "Hey, I'm teaching research methods at this class at this university, and guess what assignments they have? We're using JARS to critique articles." And I'm like, I want to see that exponential effect where they're using it with their supervisees, they're using it with their future classes they're teaching, they're using it in their own research, right? That's what's meaningful to me.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you both. Yeah, I don't see other questions coming in, so Barbara, over to you.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to Drs. Stretch and Bonfini for providing this really helpful, thorough overview of JARS and for sharing how important it is in really promoting transparent and rigorous research, starting from the classroom. As mentioned, this recording will be available to all attendees and will be available online. You will receive an email with that information. The Q&A portion will also be open for the next 3 days, and we'll be monitoring that area too. And yeah, as David mentioned, we do have a bunch of resources that we noted in our slides and that we will provide to you after this recording is posted online. So again, thank you everyone for participating and thank you for our presenters, and please stay tuned for future JARS webinars. Thank you all.